The rain had the decency to wait until the coffins were lowered. Lady Beatrice Langford stood at the graveside in the small churchyard off Grosvenor Chapel and watched the two polished caskets descend side by side into the same dark trench, and she did not weep, because weeping was a luxury that belonged to people who had someone else to manage things. She had 3 someone elses, and they were standing beside her in a row. Henry, 14 and rigid with the terrible effort of being a man. Charlotte, 11 and white-lipped. Penelope, 8, with her small gloved hand crushed inside Beatrice's own. And as long as they were watching her, Beatrice would stand very straight and keep her face composed and be the thing they needed, which was a person who had not yet fallen apart. The Earl and Countess of Langford had died as they had lived, together and somewhat carelessly. A wet road outside Richmond, a coachman who had taken a corner with more confidence than the conditions allowed, an overturned carriage in a ditch. It had been instantaneous, the surgeon assured them, as though that were a comfort. Beatrice had received the news at 9:30 in the morning while flouring her hands for the day's bread, and she had stood very still in the kitchen for the length of one long breath. And then she had washed her hands and gone to find her brother and sisters, because someone had to tell them, and there was no one else. There was never anyone else. That was the thing about being the practical one, the eldest. The dutiful daughter who had quietly run the Langford estate for 6 years while her father lost himself in schemes, and her mother lost herself in the social whirl and society, wrote Beatrice off at 21 and then 24 and now 27, as a spinster who had missed her chance and made herself useful instead. They were not entirely wrong. She had made herself useful. She had simply never been given the choice to be anything else. "Will they be cold?" Penelope whispered. "In the ground. Will Mama and Papa be cold?" "No, dearest," Beatrice murmured, because the truth was not what an 8-year-old needed at a graveside. "They are warm and safe and together. That is all over for them now, the cold and the worry. It is only ours to carry." She had not yet understood how much. The will was read 3 days later, in the offices of Messrs. Crabbe and Whitfield on Chancery Lane, and it detonated quietly in the middle of Beatrice's careful composure. Mr. Whitfield, an elderly man with the apologetic manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, worked his way through the standard provisions, the entail to Henry, the modest portions for the girls, the small bequests to faithful servants, and Beatrice followed it all with the half of her attention not occupied by the mental arithmetic of how a grieving household of 4 was to be maintained on an estate she privately knew to be more encumbered than anyone suspected. And then Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat and said, "We come now to the matter of the guardianship of the minor children." "That is simple enough," Beatrice said. "I am their sister. I have raised them in every practical sense for years. I shall continue to do so." "Ah," Mr. Whitfield looked at the document, and then at her, and then at the document again, with the expression of a man who would very much prefer to be elsewhere. The late Earl's wishes were rather more particular. He named 2 co-guardians, to act jointly until Lord Henry attains his majority at 18. A pause. "Yourself, Lady Beatrice, and Gabriel Wickliffe, the Marquess of Thornmere." The room went very quiet. "That is impossible," Beatrice said. "There must be an error. The Marquess of Thornmere is, our families do not. There has been a feud between the Langfords and the Wickliffes for 2 generations, over the boundary lands at Thornmere Beck. My grandfather and his grandfather did not speak. My father and the present Marquess have never, to my knowledge, exchanged a civil word in their lives. Why in heaven's name would my father name him? It made no sense. Of all the men in England, of all the respectable, neutral, unrelated men her father might have chosen to share the gravest responsibility of his life, he had chosen the one whose very name had been a curse, at the Langford dinner table for as long as Beatrice could remember. She had grown up understanding the Wickliffes the way one understands weather or original sin as a fixed and hostile fact of the world, and now her father from beyond the grave had bound her to the head of that house for 9 years. "I cannot speak to the late Earl's reasoning," said Mr. Whitfield, "only to his instructions, which are unambiguous. The 2 of you are to share guardianship. Neither may act unilaterally in matters concerning the children's welfare, education, residence, or fortune. In the event of disagreement," he turned a page, "in the event of disagreement, the matter is to be referred to the Court of Chancery." Beatrice sat very still and felt the floor of her carefully constructed future tilt beneath her. The door opened. She did not need to be told who he was, The Marquess of Thornmere filled the doorway the way that certain men fill doorways, not through size alone, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but through a kind of gathered stillness, an authority that arrived before he did. He was perhaps 36, with dark hair threaded silver at the temples and a face that had been handsome before life had carved it into something harder. Grey eyes, a stern mouth, the bearing of a man who had been carrying things alone for a very long time and had stopped expecting help. He looked at the assembled company with the expression of a man surveying a problem he had not asked for and did not want. "My apologies," he said. His voice was low and controlled. "My carriage was delayed. I trust you have reached the relevant clause." "We have, my lord," said Mr. Whitfield. "I was just. Then I will save us all some time." The Marquess did not sit. He remained standing, hat in hand, with the air of a man who intended this to be brief. "I was as astonished as anyone to find myself named in Langford's will. I had not seen the man in a decade, and our families have despised one another since before either of us was born. But the instruction is clear, and I am not a man who shirks a duty merely because it is unwelcome." He turned his grey eyes on Beatrice, and there was nothing warm in them. "I propose the sensible course. The boy is 14, old enough for Harrow or Eton. I will make the arrangements. The girls can go to a respectable seminary in Bath. There are several. You, Lady Beatrice, are of an age and circumstance to marry, and with a guardian of my standing to settle a portion on you, you will have no difficulty securing a husband. The estate can be administered by stewards under our joint oversight. The children will be provided for, properly educated, and the whole matter resolved with a minimum of disruption to anyone's life, including mine." Beatrice rose from her chair. She was not a tall woman, and she was aware that beside him she likely looked exactly what society took her for. A plain, practical spinster in unflattering morning black. She did not care. Something cold and clear and absolutely certain had crystallized inside her at the words "ship them off," and when she spoke, her voice was very steady. "My lord," she said, "you have just proposed to take 3 grieving children, who lost their mother and father 4 days ago, who have never in their lives slept a night under a strange roof, the youngest of whom still asks me whether her parents are cold in the ground, and scatter them across England to institutions full of strangers, because it would be convenient. You speak of them as though they were parcels to be redirected. You have not asked their names. You have not asked what they need. You have decided, in the space of 1 minute, to dismantle the only family they have left, and you call it sensible." The Marquess's jaw tightened. "Sentiment will not serve them, Lady Beatrice. The world is not kind to orphans with insufficient education and no connections. I am proposing what is best for them." "You are proposing what is easiest for you," Beatrice said. "Do not dress it as their welfare. I have raised those children. I bathed Penelope's fevers and taught Charlotte her letters and sat up with Henry the night he was certain he would never be man enough to be an earl. I know what they need, because I am the only person in this room who has ever troubled to learn it. And I will tell you precisely what they need, my lord. They need to be kept together. They need to be loved. And they will not be parceled out to seminaries and schools while I draw breath. Not for your convenience, not for anyone's. I will fight you in every court in England before I allow it." There was a silence so complete that Beatrice could hear the clock on the mantel. The Marquess looked at her for a long moment, really looked, perhaps for the first time, his grey eyes moving over her face with an expression she could not read. "Then we are at an impasse," he said quietly. "Which, the will instructs, must be referred to Chancery." "So it must," said Beatrice. The court, when it considered the matter, produced an outcome that satisfied no one. The guardianship was contested. Beatrice had retained a solicitor and intended to seek sole custody. The Marquess, it emerged, intended to seek the same, and the Court of Chancery, presented with 2 co-guardians at war and 3 vulnerable children in the balance, did what courts do when they wish to avoid deciding anything. It ordered a delay and a period of observation, and, to Beatrice's horror and the Marquess's visible displeasure, it ordered that until the matter was resolved, the guardians and their wards should reside together, so that the court might assess the children's circumstances and the suitability of each party, together, under one roof. At Thornmere Hall, the Marquess's seat in Yorkshire, 300 miles from everything Beatrice's siblings had ever known. "It is monstrous," Beatrice told her solicitor. "It is temporary," the solicitor replied, "and it is, I am afraid, not negotiable. The court wishes to see how the children fare. Demonstrate that you provide them a stable and loving home, my lady, and you will have made your case for sole custody far better than any argument I could put before the bench. So Beatrice packed 3 trunks of children's clothing and 1 trunk of her own determination, and she gathered her grieving siblings, and she travelled north into Yorkshire to take up residence in the house of her family's ancient enemy, armed with nothing but the absolute conviction that whatever it cost her, she would not let these children be broken further than they already were. Autumn at Thornmere Hall. Thornmere Hall was the coldest house Beatrice had ever entered, and not merely in temperature. It was vast, a great grey pile of Yorkshire stone sprawling across a fold of the moors, with wings that had been shut up for years and corridors that echoed, and rooms so large and so sparsely furnished that voices died in them. It was clean, and it was maintained, and it was as devoid of warmth as a museum. There were no flowers. There were no small disorders of habitation, no abandoned books, no forgotten shawls, no evidence anywhere that a human being actually lived here rather than merely occupied it. It was the house of a man who had stopped expecting to be happy and had arranged his surroundings accordingly. The children hated it on sight. "It's like a tomb," Charlotte announced in the great echoing entrance hall, with the brutal honesty of 11. "Are we to live in a tomb now, Bea?" "We are to live here for a little while," Beatrice said, "and we shall make it considerably less tomb-like before we are through. Penelope, dearest, do stop hiding behind me. The Marquess will not eat you." The Marquess, descending the great staircase to greet his unwelcome guests, did not look entirely certain that he would not. He stopped 3 steps from the bottom and surveyed the 3 children with the wary expression of a man who has agreed to house wild animals and is only now reckoning with the practicalities. "Lord Henry," he said with a stiff nod to the boy, "you are the Earl now, my condolences." Henry, who had been silent and grey-faced since London, drew himself up. "Thank you, my lord. Lady Charlotte, Miss Penelope." A nod to each, Penelope shrank further behind Beatrice's skirts. "I have had rooms prepared in the east wing. The nursery has been opened and aired. My housekeeper, Mrs. Goss, will see to whatever you require. I keep early hours and I dine at 7. I trust you will find everything." He hesitated, as though the word comfortable was one he did not often have occasion to use, and adequate. "Adequate," Beatrice repeated. "How very encouraging." His grey eyes flicked to her. "Lady Beatrice, we are, I understand, to be observed by the court for our suitability. I would suggest that we both make an effort to keep our disagreements from the children and the servants, for their sake." "On that," Beatrice said, "we are in perfect agreement. I have no wish to distress them further. I would simply ask one thing of you in return, my lord, and that is, that before you decide what these children need, you trouble yourself to learn who they are." She met his gaze without flinching. "Henry reads everything he can find and is terrified he will fail as Earl. Charlotte would live in a stable if we let her, and has not cried once since the funeral, which worries me more than if she wept all day. And Penelope," she felt the small hand tightened in hers, "Penelope draws beautifully, and she has not picked up a pencil since her parents died. That is who they are, my lord, not parcels, not problems, people, with grief and with gifts, and with a desperate need to be allowed to stay together and to feel, eventually, that somewhere in the world is still a home." She lifted her chin. "I intend to give them one. Even here, even in your tomb, you are welcome to watch." And she swept past him up the stairs with 3 children in her wake, and did not see the strange, arrested expression on the Marquess's face as he watched her go. She began, as she always began when the world overwhelmed her with bread. Mrs. Goss, the housekeeper, a stout, careworn woman who had clearly not had occasion to smile in this house for some years, was scandalized to find the future lady of nowhere in particular rolling up her sleeves in the Thornmere kitchens on the 2nd morning. But Beatrice had a way of making her certainty contagious, and within an hour she had charmed the cook, commandeered a corner of the great kitchen table, and produced the first loaves of honest bread the house had seen in longer than anyone could remember. It was Penelope who crept down first, drawn by the smell. "You may help," Beatrice said, not looking up, knowing the child would bolt if approached directly. "If you wish, wash your hands first. There is dough enough for 2. And Penelope, after a long hesitation, washed her small hands and came to the table, and Beatrice taught her to knead, the heel of the hand, the fold, the turn. And for the first time since the funeral, the 8-year-old's face lost its frozen look, absorbed in the simple animal comfort of working dough with her hands. The baking became a refuge, then a habit, then, somehow, a small daily institution, and the warmth of it began, slowly like spring coming to the moors, to spread through the cold house, the kitchen, which had been a place of silent efficiency, filled with the smell of bread and the low murmur of a child's questions, and, once or twice, the astonishing sound of Penelope's laughter. Mrs. Goss took to lingering in the doorway. The cook, a taciturn Yorkshire woman named Mrs. Tunstall, began saving the choicest jobs for the little lass, and pretended she had not. Beatrice turned her attention next to Charlotte, who was prowling the estate like a caged thing, and she did the only sensible thing. She found her a horse. The Thornmere stables were excellent, the one part of the estate, Beatrice noted, that showed evidence of genuine care, and the head groom, a weathered man named Dawkins who had served 3 generations of Wycliffes, was won over within an afternoon by Charlotte's fearless competence and her absolute refusal to be intimidated by a horse twice her size. He was soon giving her lessons across the moors that returned her flushed and windblown, and for whole hours at a time, almost happy. Beatrice watched from the paddock fence one grey morning as the girl took a low stone wall at a canter, whooping, and thought, "There, that is the first time she has forgotten to be sad." It was a small victory. Beatrice had learned to count in small victories. Henry was harder. The boy's grief had turned inward, expressing itself as a grim, joyless determination to be worthy of the title that had fallen on him too young. He shut himself in the Thornmere library, which was, Beatrice had to admit, magnificent, and worked his way through treatises on estate management and law and agriculture, with the desperate focus of a boy trying to outrun his own sorrow. He ate little, he slept less. He had appointed himself, Beatrice understood, the man of the family, and the weight of it was crushing him, and she did not know how to lift it, because she could not pretend the weight was not real. It was the Marquess, unexpectedly, who reached him. Beatrice came upon them one afternoon in the library, Gabriel Wycliffe and the new young Earl, bent together over a great ledger, the Marquess explaining something about drainage and crop rotation in a low, patient voice while Henry listened with an intensity Beatrice had not seen in him since before the accident. She stopped in the doorway, unobserved, and watched. "You will make mistakes," the Marquess was saying. "Every man who manages land does. I made a great many when I came into my own title at 23, with no father to guide me and no one to ask. The trick is not to avoid mistakes, that is impossible, but to make them small, and to learn from them, and never to be too proud to ask the man who knows the land better than you do. Your steward has worked Langford 40 years. Listen to him. He will teach you more than any treatise." "My father never asked anyone," Henry said quietly. "He thought it weakness, and he made the estate worse." A pause. "Your father," the Marquess said carefully, "loved you, whatever his failings as a man of business. Do not let his mistakes become your inheritance, Henry. You may keep what was good in him and leave the rest. That is allowed. No one will think less of you for it." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very low, "Thank you, sir," and bent back to the ledger, and Beatrice withdrew silently into the corridor before either of them could see the unexpected tightness in her throat. So, the tomb had a heart in it somewhere after all. She filed the discovery away, uncertain what to do with it. The ledgers brought them together, in the end. It was inevitable. They were 2 people responsible for one tangled estate, and the work did not respect the hour. It began with Beatrice finding the Marquess in his study at midnight, surrounded by the Langford accounts. The real ones, the ones she had spent 6 years quietly managing, with an expression of grim comprehension. "You knew," he said as she came in. "It was not a question. About the debts, the mortgages on the Hampshire farms, the loans your father took against the London house. You knew all of it." "I knew all of it," Beatrice agreed. She came and sat across the desk from him without being invited, because she was tired of standing on ceremony in a house she was determined to make a home. "I have known for years. I have been holding it together with careful management and an absolute refusal to let anyone see how bad it was. My father did not have the temperament for retrenchment. My mother did not have the temperament for economy. So I did it for them, quietly, because the alternative was ruin, and ruin would have fallen hardest on the children." The Marquess looked at her across the candlelit desk, and for the first time the grey eyes held something other than reserve. "You have been carrying this alone. There was no one else to carry it, and no one knew. Society saw a spinster who was good with household accounts," Beatrice said. "It suited everyone to see no more than that. A clever woman is alarming. A useful one is convenient. I learned long ago which it was safer to be." She nodded at the ledgers. "It is recoverable. My lord, if it is managed properly, the Hampshire farms can be made to pay. The London house should be let, not sold. The children's portions are protected. I made certain of that. It will take 5 years of discipline, but the estate can be saved. The Marquess studied her with an arrested expression. You have a remarkable mind, Lady Beatrice. I have a necessary one. There is a difference. I was not permitted the luxury of being remarkable, only of being indispensable. She paused, and then, because the hour was late, and the candle was low, and something in him invited honesty, she added, Why does this house have no warmth in it, my lord? You are clearly capable of it. I have seen you with Henry, and yet you live like a monk in a fortress. Why? The Marquess was silent for a long moment. Then he set down his pen. My mother left when I was 9, he said. Simply left. Ran off with a cavalry officer to the continent and never wrote, never returned, never sent so much as a word. My father never recovered. He shut up half the house. Her rooms, the morning room where she used to sit, the music room, and he forbade us to speak of her. And he drank himself into the grave by the time I was 23, leaving me a title, a wastrel younger brother, and a house full of locked doors. He looked around the cold, austere study. I learned young, that warmth is what they take from you when they go, that a home is simply a larger thing to lose. So I stopped building one. It seemed safer. And your brother, Julian. A muscle worked in his jaw. Gambling, debts. He surfaces when he wants money and vanishes when he has it. The last of my family, and I cannot trust him with a £5 note. So he spread his hands, taking in the cold room, the lonely house, the careful, defended life. You asked why there is no warmth in this house. Lady Beatrice, there is your answer. I have spent 20 years making certain there was nothing here worth losing. Beatrice looked at this proud, guarded, lonely man across the dying candle, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not entirely welcome. And now, she said quietly, I have arrived with 3 children and a determination to fill your fortress with bread and horses and drawings, whether you like it or not. A ghost of something that was almost a smile touched the stern mouth. Yes, Gabriel said, so you have. I find I do not know what to do about it. Nothing, Beatrice said, rising and gathering her shawl. You need do nothing at all, my lord. Simply let it happen. You may find the having is worth the risk of the losing. Good night. The small charged moments accumulated after that, like snow. There was the afternoon Henry scraped his knee, badly falling from the orchard wall, and Beatrice knelt to bandage it, and Gabriel knelt beside her to help, and his large hands closed over hers to steady the linen, and they both went very still at the contact, and neither of them moved for a moment longer than the task required. There was the evening she found him standing in the doorway of the long-shut music room, his mother's room, that she had quietly had Mrs. Goss open and air and fill with the children's noise, and he did not reprimand her, only stood looking at the laughing children at the old pianoforte, with an expression of such raw, complicated feeling that she had touched his arm without thinking, and he had not pulled away. And there was the night, late, when all 3 children were finally asleep, and Beatrice came down to the nursery to check on Penelope, and found Gabriel there before her, standing over the sleeping child with the strangest tenderness on his stern face. And a music box was playing, a small tinny waltz, wound by some child's hand and not yet run down, and Beatrice said softly, Dance with me, surprising herself. And Gabriel looked at her for a long moment and then, wordlessly, drew her into a slow, quiet waltz across the nursery floor, between the sleeping children, to the thread of a winding down music box. It was the most intimate thing that had ever happened to either of them. There was no music to speak of. The faltering tin notes, and the sound of their own breathing and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. He held her carefully, as though she were something he was afraid of breaking, or perhaps as though he were afraid of being broken. His hand at her waist was warm through the muslin. Her cheek, when she tired of holding herself apart, came to rest against the broad, solid warmth of his chest, and she felt him go still and then felt him exhale, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for 20 years. I have not danced, he murmured against her hair. Since before my mother left, there was no one to dance with, and then there was no one I wished to. And now? He did not answer in words. He only drew her a fraction closer, and turned her slowly through the dark, and that was answer enough. Neither of them said anything more, and when the music box ran down at last into silence, they simply stood, holding one another, in the dark, between the breathing children, neither willing to be the first to let go. Beatrice was falling in love with him. She knew it with the same clear practicality she brought to everything, and it terrified her, because she could not afford it. Could not afford to lose her focus. Could not afford to want something for herself when the children needed all of her. Could not afford to hope. So she said nothing, and he said nothing, and they circled the growing truth between them, like two people walking around a fire, drawn to the warmth and frightened of the burn. Sir Reginald Langford struck in October. He was a distant cousin of the late Earl, a smooth, pale, plausible man whom Beatrice had met perhaps twice in her life and disliked on both occasions, and he had been, it emerged, watching the situation with the patience of a spider. His petition arrived at the court with a flourish. He alleged that the present guardians were unfit, that the children were being raised in an irregular and scandalous household, an unmarried lady, residing with an unmarried gentleman, however many chaperoning servants, and, most damningly, he produced letters, purportedly written by the late Earl, expressing the wish that should anything befall him, his children be removed from unsuitable influences and placed under the protection of his cousin Reginald, with the estate administered accordingly until they came of age. The letters were forgeries. Beatrice knew it the moment she read the copies, knew her father's hand, knew his turns of phrase, knew that he had never in his life called Reginald anything but that oily fellow. But forgeries skillfully done, and a court already inclined to caution, and the genuine awkwardness of the living arrangement made the threat deadly serious. He wants the estate, Beatrice said, pacing Gabriel's study with the letters crushed in her hand. He does not care a fig for the children. He wants them made wards of Chancery so that he can have himself appointed administrator, and then he will bleed the estate dry while they moulder in his keeping. I know his sort. He is the reason I learned to manage accounts. I watched him circle my father like a vulture for years. Then we must defeat him, Gabriel said. We must present a united front, Beatrice said grimly. That is what our solicitors say. The court must see a harmonious, stable, respectable household, two guardians in perfect accord, providing the children a loving and proper home. We must, in short, my lord, perform a family, convincingly, until the matter is decided. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. That, he said, may be less of a performance than you suppose. Their eyes met across the study, and the air between them grew charged and difficult. And Beatrice looked away first, because she did not trust what her face might do. The performance was easier and harder than either expected. Easier, because it required them only to do, in public and with intention, what they had increasingly been doing in private without admitting it, to sit together at the family table, to consult one another over the children, to present the warm and united front that had, somewhere in the long Yorkshire autumn, stopped being entirely a fiction. Harder, because the closeness it demanded made the unspoken thing between them almost unbearable, a pressure building behind a dam neither of them would name. It broke on a rain-lashed night in November. Penelope had a nightmare, a terrible one, the kind grief produces, in which she dreamed her parents were calling her from somewhere cold, and she could not reach them, and her screaming brought the whole house. Beatrice reached her first, gathering the sobbing child against her, but it was Gabriel who came next, in his shirt-sleeves with a candle, and it was Gabriel whom Penelope, in her terror, reached for, holding out her small arms to the stern Marquess as though he were the safest thing in the world. He took her. Of course he took her. He gathered the weeping child against his broad chest with an instinctive tenderness that undid Beatrice completely, and he murmured to her, low, steady, nonsense words of comfort. You are safe, little one. No one is cold. No one is lost. You are safe, and you are loved, and you are home. And he carried her, walking the dark nursery, until the sobs gentled, and the small body went heavy with returning sleep. And Beatrice stood in the doorway, and watched the man who had wanted to ship these children off to schools cradle the youngest of them through her grief, and she understood that whatever the court decided, whatever the will demanded, whatever the impossible obstacles, she loved him entirely, and there was no longer any use pretending otherwise. When Penelope was finally settled, Gabriel laid her gently in her bed and tucked the blankets around her, and he turned and found Beatrice watching him, and the look that passed between them in the candlelit nursery contained everything they had both been refusing to say. He crossed the room to her. She did not retreat. Beatrice, he said, her name, just her name with no title before it, in a voice gone rough. Gabriel. And then she was in his arms, and he was holding her the way a drowning man holds the thing that saves him. And it was not the careful comfort he had given the child. It was something else entirely, fierce and desperate and long denied. his face buried in her hair, her hands fisted in his shirt, the two of them clinging together in the dark with 2 years and 20 years of loneliness collapsing all at once. "I cannot do this alone anymore," he said against her hair. "I have been alone for 20 years, and I told myself I preferred it. And then you came into my cold house with your bread and your children, and your maddening, indestructible warmth, and now I cannot. Beatrice, I cannot imagine this house without you in it. I will not survive it. I have made myself a fortress, and you have simply walked in through the front door, as though the walls were not there at all." "They were never as high as you thought," Beatrice whispered. "I have been climbing them since the day I arrived." He drew back just far enough to look at her, and his stern face was open and undefended, and full of a hope so fragile it broke her heart. And he lowered his head, and they did not kiss. Not then. Because Charlotte's voice came down the corridor. "Bae, is Penny all right?" And they sprang apart, and the moment folded itself away unfinished, and they were two guardians again, composed and proper, attending to a frightened child. But it had happened, the dam had broken, and neither of them could pretend, after that what lay between them was anything other than what it was. Winter at Thornmere Hall, Beatrice found the clause by accident, which was how the worst things were always found. She had been in the Thornmere muniment room, searching through the bundled legal papers for documents to support their case against Reginald, and she had come upon a packet relating to the Thornmere title itself, the original patent, the entail, the conditions of inheritance. And among them, in the crabbed legal hand of some long-dead lawyer, she found a clause she had not known existed, and which stopped her heart. The Thornmere Marquessate, it transpired, was not a simple inheritance. It carried a condition, an ancient, peculiar condition imposed by some long-dead Wycliffe ancestor with rigid views about blood and lineage. The holder of the title might marry only within a list of approved bloodlines, the old allied families of the region, of which, by a bitter irony Beatrice could scarcely credit, the Langfords had once been one before the feud. But the feud had occurred. The grandfathers had quarrelled, and in the heat of that quarrel, Beatrice discovered from a later codicil the Langford line had been struck from the approved list by Gabriel's grandfather, removed, in spite, as part of the very dispute that had divided the families. The meaning was brutally clear. If Gabriel, Marquess of Thornmere, married a Langford, married Beatrice, he would marry outside the bloodline, and the title, the lands, the entire Thornmere legacy that he had spent 20 years guarding at the cost of his own happiness, would be forfeit. It would pass to a distant Wycliffe cousin. Gabriel would lose everything he had been born to protect. Beatrice sat down on the dusty floor of the muniment room, with the papers in her lap, and understood that the thing she had finally allowed herself to want was, by the cruel arithmetic of law and old hatred, impossible. She told him that evening. She would not keep it from him. She had spent her life keeping difficult truths from people who could not bear them, and she would not do it to Gabriel, who could. He read the clause in silence. His face, as he read, settled back into the stern, defended lines she had not seen in weeks, the fortress, rebuilding itself stone by stone before her eyes. "I see," he said when he had finished. "Gabriel, it is quite clear." His voice was flat, controlled, terrible. "I cannot marry you without forfeiting the title. And the title is not mine to throw away. It is, Beatrice, there are tenants, dependents, an entire estate of people whose welfare rests on the Thornmere succession passing to a man who will care for it. I cannot hand all of that to a cousin I have never met to satisfy my own, to satisfy myself. It would be the most profound dereliction of duty. My whole life has been duty. I do not know how to set it down. Then we will find another way." "There is no other way." He set the papers down with awful gentleness. "I have spent 20 years learning that I am not permitted to want things. I allowed myself to forget it these last months. That was my error. I will not compound it." He looked at her, and the pain in his grey eyes was the only thing that betrayed the cost of the words. "We will see the children safe. We will defeat Reginald. And then I think it would be best, Beatrice, if you and the children removed to Langford once the court permits, for all our sakes. Because I cannot offer you what you deserve, and I cannot continue to live beside you, offering you nothing." And he left the room before she could answer, because he was as a coward about exactly one thing in the world, and that thing was hope. The children, who missed nothing, sensed the rift at once. They had been, Beatrice realized later, quietly campaigning for weeks. 100 small conspiracies designed to throw the adults together, to make them smile, to bind the strange new household into something permanent. They had seen with the clear eyes of children what the adults were too frightened to name, and when the warmth between Beatrice and Gabriel abruptly froze over, they responded with the full strategic ingenuity of three clever, desperate, grieving children who had decided that this was the family they wanted and were not prepared to lose it. They staged small rebellions. Charlotte refused to ride unless both guardians came to watch. Penelope developed a sudden inability to sleep unless both Beatrice and Gabriel said, "Good night." Henry, with the gravity of the man of the family, took to engineering reasons that the two adults must consult one another. A question about the estate, a decision about the schoolroom, a matter that only the both of them together could resolve. It was Henry, too, who found the letters. He had been in the Thornmere library, his refuge, as the kitchen was Penelope's and the stables were Charlotte's, working through an old chest of family papers that the Marquess had given him leave to explore when he came upon a bundle of correspondence between the two grandfathers. The Langford grandfather and the Wycliffe grandfather, the originators of the feud. He brought them to Beatrice that evening, white-faced with the importance of what he had found. "Bea," he said. "The feud, the land dispute at Thornmere Beck, it wasn't real. Look, the letters told the whole sordid human story. The two grandfathers, old friends it transpired, intimates from their youth, had together accumulated a catastrophic gambling debt at a London. Hell, the sort of debt that could ruin two families, and rather than admit it, rather than face the shame of it, they had concocted a feud. A loud, public, bitter quarrel over the boundary lands at Thornmere Beck, a quarrel that had given each of them cover to sell off the disputed parcels, quietly to settle the debt, while presenting the sales to the world as the spoils of an ancient enmity. The feud was a lie, a face-saving fiction, invented by two frightened men to hide a shared disgrace, and then inherited by their sons and grandsons as genuine hatred, two families divided for 2 generations by a quarrel that had never truly existed. There was even in the last letter of the bundle a note of something like grief between the two old men. "I am sorry it must not be this way, James," Gabriel's grandfather had written to Beatrice's. "We were better friends than this. But the world must never know how close we came to ruin, and a quarrel is the only mask that will serve. Let them believe we hate one another. We will know the truth, you and I, and carry it to our graves." And carry it they had, so thoroughly that the truth had died with them, and the mask had been mistaken by everyone who came after for the living face. "They were friends," Henry said wonderingly. "Our grandfather and his. They were friends, Bea. It was all made up. 2 generations of it, the way Papa wouldn't let the Wycliffe name be spoken at table, the way everyone said the families were cursed to hate each other. All of it, over a card debt and a lie." Beatrice held the letters in her hands and felt something enormous shift inside her, because if the feud was a fiction, if the enmity between Langford and Wycliffe was nothing but a lie told by 2 desperate men a half-century ago, then the striking of the Langford name from the approved bloodlines had been done in the service of that same lie. Not out of any real principle, not for any reason that deserved to stand. It had been an act of theatre, of spite, of cover-up, and theatre could be exposed. Lies could be overturned. A condition imposed in bad faith for a feud that had never been real was a condition that a court of equity might be persuaded to set aside. She found Gabriel in his study. She did not knock. She walked in and put the letters on his desk and said, "Read these, and then we are going to talk about duty, my lord, because I have something to say to you about it that you very much need to hear." He read the letters. She watched the understanding move across his face, the same understanding that had moved across hers. "The feud," he said slowly. It was never real. 2 cowards and a gambling debt, and the clause that strikes the Langfords from your precious bloodline was part of the same lie, invented spite in service of fiction. She leaned across the desk, her hazel eyes fierce. "So let me tell you about duty. Gabriel Wycliffe, since you are so very devoted to it, you have spent 20 years treating duty as a wall to hide behind, as a reason not to want, not to hope, not to risk. You have made duty into an excuse for cowardice and called it honor, but duty is not the absence of love. Duty is not a fortress against feeling. Duty is what you owe to the people you are responsible for, and you are responsible, now, for 3 children who have lost everything and found, in this cold house, a family they are fighting with every small rebellion they can devise to keep. That is your duty, my lord, not to a title imposed by a condition born of a lie, to them, to us, to the family we have built around your dinner table while you were frightened to notice it becoming the only thing either of us has ever truly wanted. Gabriel stared at her. And as for the title, Beatrice went on, relentless now, we will fight the clause. The feud was a fiction. The striking of the Langford name was done in bad faith. Any court of equity in England can be made to see it. Perhaps we win and you keep your marquessate. Perhaps we lose and you do not. But I will tell you this, Gabriel. A title you keep at the cost of the only love you have ever known is not a legacy. It is a tomb. You have lived in one for 20 years. I have spent these months proving to you that you need not. Do not climb back into it now, and call the climbing duty when what it truly is fear. There was a long, ringing silence, and then Gabriel Wycliffe, Marquess of Thornmere, came around the desk and took her face in his hands and kissed her, fiercely, finally, completely. And Beatrice, who had been so practical for so long, who had carried so much for so many, finally let herself be held. I have been a fool, he said against her mouth. Beatrice agreed. A very tall, very stern, very devoted fool. We will fight the clause, and whatever happens, we will face it together. But first, she drew back, suddenly remembering. First, my love, we must defeat Reginald, because none of this matters if we lose the children. The final hearing was held at York in the first week of December, in a panelled courtroom gone grey with winter light, and Sir Reginald Langford arrived confident of victory. He had reason to be. His forged letters were skillful, the irregularity of the household was genuine, and he had retained a clever barrister who painted a vivid picture of two unmarried guardians cohabiting in scandalous proximity while three vulnerable children languished neglected in a cold Yorkshire manor. He spoke of the late Earl's clear wishes. He spoke of his own selfless willingness to assume the burden. He very nearly carried the room. And then the children testified. It had been Henry's idea, and Beatrice had resisted it fiercely. She would not put them through more, would not make them perform their grief for a courtroom. But Henry, with the new gravity of the man he was becoming, had insisted. We are the only ones who can say what it's like, Bea, he had told her. Not what the letters say, what it's really like, and we want to, all of us. Let us fight for our family too. So Henry took the stand, 14 and steady, and told the court, in his clear young voice, about a guardian who had taught him that a man may keep what was good in his father and leave the rest, who had sat with him over the ledgers and never once made him feel a fool. And Charlotte took the stand, 11 and fierce, and told the court about riding across the moors and feeling, for the first time since her parents died, that she could breathe. And little Penelope, shy Penelope, who had not spoken to a stranger in months, took the stand last, clutching a piece of paper. When the kind old judge asked her gently what she wished to tell the court, she held up the paper, and it was a drawing. It was a drawing of all 5 of them, Beatrice and Gabriel and the 3 children around a table, with a loaf of bread in the middle, and what was unmistakably a horse looking in through a window. And at the bottom, in a careful child's hand, she had written, "My family, this is us," Penelope told the judge in her small voice. I drew it. I didn't draw anything for a long time because I was too sad, but then we got a family again, and now I can draw. And I don't want a different one. I want this one, please. Her chin wobbled. Please don't make us go with the man with the letters. He's never even asked my name. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge, an old man who had spent 40 years watching families tear one another apart over money and titles and the cold machinery of inheritance, was observed to remove his spectacles and polish them at some length. And it was Penelope, in the end, who undid Reginald entirely, for when his barrister rose to cross-examine the child and asked, in a tone of false gentleness, whether anyone had told her what to say, the little girl looked at him with grave, clear eyes and said, "No, but I know my own papa's writing, sir, and the writing in those letters isn't his. Bea showed me. The G's are wrong. My papa made his G's with a little loop and these don't have it. And he always crossed his 7s, like they do in France, because he travelled there when he was young. The man who wrote those letters didn't cross his 7s, so he didn't know my papa at all, did he? It was such a small thing, such a precise, devastating, childish thing, and it was enough to crack the case open. Because once the question of the forgery had been raised by an 8-year-old who knew her father's hand, Beatrice's solicitor was ready with the genuine letters, the handwriting expert, and the bank records showing that Sir Reginald Langford's own estate was mortgaged to the rafters, giving him a powerful and disqualifying motive to seize control of his cousin's fortune. Reginald's case collapsed entirely. By the afternoon, the court had not only dismissed his petition, but referred the matter of the forged letters to the criminal authorities, and, observing the evident devotion of the children to their guardians, and the manifest stability and warmth of the household they had built, had ruled that Lady Beatrice Langford and the Marquess of Thornmere should retain joint guardianship with the court's full confidence they had won. The children were safe. It was snowing when they returned to Thornmere Hall that evening, great soft flakes falling through the blue dusk, gathering on the grey stone, transforming the austere old house into something out of a story. The children tumbled from the carriage, shrieking with the joy of victory and snow, and Mrs. Goss, who had learned to smile again these past months, came out to meet them with hot chocolate and the news that the cook had made a celebration pudding. And in the snow-covered courtyard, before the whole family, with the lit windows of the house glowing gold behind them, Gabriel Wycliffe took Beatrice's hand and went down on one knee in the snow. "Gabriel," Beatrice said, "you'll catch your death." "Be quiet, my love. I am proposing," he said, and the children went instantly, breathlessly silent, and Penelope's small hands flew to her mouth. "I came here," Gabriel said, looking up at her, the snow gathering in his silver-threaded hair, "to guard a title and 4 strangers. I told myself it was a duty to be endured and dispatched as quickly as possible so that I might return to my cold house and my safe, empty life. I was a fool." He drew a breath, "because I stayed, and these strangers became, Beatrice, they became the only family I have ever truly had. This messy, loud, imperfect, impossible household is the only home I have ever wanted. And I did not even know I wanted it until you walked into my fortress with a trunk full of determination and refused to be kept out. You taught me that a home is not a larger thing to lose, it is the only thing worth having." His voice roughened. "We will fight the clause. We may win, we may lose. I find I no longer care, because a title without you in this house is nothing I want to keep. So I am asking you, before this family that is already ours in every way that matters, marry me, Beatrice, not for the will, not for duty, not for any reason but that these children already call us theirs. And so, with all my heart do I." Beatrice looked down at this proud, stern, transformed man kneeling in the snow, and at the 3 children watching with their hearts in their faces, and at the warm golden house that had been a tomb and was now unmistakably a home, and she began to laugh, even as her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you ridiculous, devoted, finally brave man. Of course, yes, I have been yours since the night you danced with me to a music box. Yes." The children erupted. Charlotte whooped. Henry grinned wider than he had since the funeral, and Penelope flung herself at the 2 of them, with such force that she nearly knocked Gabriel over into the snow, and he caught her, laughing, actually laughing, openly, the sound ringing across the white courtyard, and gathered all of them in. Beatrice and the 3 children both, the whole improbable family, into one snow-dusted, joyful embrace, and up at the nursery window Mrs. Goss and the cook watched the scene below and dabbed at their eyes and agreed that they had never, in all their years at cold Thornmere Hall, seen anything half so fine. 2 years later, Thornmere Hall rang with laughter from dawn to dusk, and no one who visited could have believed it had ever been called a tomb. The clause had been overturned. As Beatrice had predicted, a court of equity had taken a dim view of a marriage condition imposed in service of a fraudulent feud, and the Langford line had been restored to the approved bloodlines with a stroke of a judge's pen, the last poison of the old lie drawn out at last. Gabriel had kept his title. He claimed not to have cared either way, and Beatrice mostly believed him. They had married in the spring following the snow, a warm, noisy, entirely ungrand ceremony at the Thornmere Chapel, with Henry standing up beside Gabriel and Charlotte and Penelope, strewing rather more flower petals than strictly necessary, and the whole estate turning out to celebrate the lord and lady who had brought the great house back to life. And in the months that followed, they had done the thing that made it all permanent and true. They had legally adopted the 3 children as their own. Henry would keep his earldom, of course, and Langford would be his when he came of age, but he would grow into it from within a family, with a mother and a father who had chosen him, rather than alone. The old feud was buried so thoroughly that the younger people of the district scarcely remembered it had existed. The 2 estates, Langford and Thornmere, were managed now in concert, prospering under Beatrice's careful hand and Gabriel's steady one and Henry's increasingly capable apprenticeship. The Hampshire farms paid. The debts were cleared. The house was full of flowers, and books left lying about, and forgotten shawls, and all the small, beautiful disorders of a place where people actually lived. Penelope's drawings hung framed throughout the house, including in the place of honor in the great hall where visitors could not miss it, the original. My family, with its loaf of bread and its horse in the window, the drawing that had won them all in a York courtroom. Penelope was 10 now, and her talent had flowered into something remarkable, and Gabriel had quietly engaged a drawing master from York and spoke, with transparent pride, of one day sending her work to the Royal Academy. There was a family dinner one evening in late spring that was no different from 100 others, and was, for that reason, exactly the point of everything. They sat around the great table in the dining room that had once echoed and now never did. Henry, 16 and easy in himself, was teasing Charlotte about a young man from the next estate who had been making excuses to ride past their gates. Charlotte, 14 and still horse-mad and entirely unbothered, was teasing him right back about a certain squire's daughter. Penelope was drawing on the back of a menu card between courses, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. The candlelight was warm. The food was good. The conversation was the comfortable, overlapping, affectionate chaos of a family entirely at ease with one another. And at the head of the table, Beatrice and Gabriel sat side by side, and beneath the cloth, where the children could not see, his hand found hers and laced their fingers together, and they shared a private smile across the candlelight. The smile of two people who had each spent their lives carrying things alone, and had found, against all the odds and all the old dead hatreds and all the cold years behind them, someone to carry things with. Happy? Gabriel murmured low for her alone. Unspeakably, Beatrice murmured back. And you, my love. He looked down the length of the warm, loud, candlelit table, at the children who were theirs, at the home they had built, at the life that had ambushed him so completely when he had been so certain he was meant to be alone, and his stern, transformed face was full of a contentment so deep it needed no words. I came here to guard a hollow title, he said quietly, and I found everything that was ever worth guarding instead. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, there beneath the table, an echo of nothing and a promise of everything. We choose each other, every single day, Beatrice agreed, and down the table, Penelope, who heard more than the grown-ups ever credited, looked up from her drawing and smiled, and added a small new figure to the family she was sketching, and then, satisfied, returned to her work in the warm golden house that was, at last and forever, a home. Thornmere Hall, Yorkshire, 1821, and ever after Sir Reginald Langford was convicted of forgery the following spring and fled to the continent to escape his creditors, where he was last reported attempting the same scheme on a different branch of the family with markedly less success. The music box, the one they had first danced to in the nursery, was kept on the mantel in their bedchamber for the rest of their lives and was wound, by family tradition on every wedding anniversary,